I am Deepu Basumutari, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Krishnakanta Hendek State Open University. In our previous video, we explored the characteristics and significance of terrorism in depth. Today in this third video, we will examine the distinction between terrorism and freedom fighters more closely. Let's uncover the key differences that define and distinguish this complex phenomena. The distinction between terrorism, freedom fighting is complex and influenced by historical, political, cultural context. While terrorism involves indiscriminate violence to instill fear, freedom fighting is seen as a struggle for self-determination and justice. The boundaries between these categories often blur as motivations, methods, and goals overlap. Historically, groups labeled as terrorists or freedom fighters depend on the perspective of those assigning the labels. For example, during the American Revolution, British authorities viewed colonies as insurgents, while colonies saw themselves as freedom fighters. Anti-colonial movements were often branded as terrorists by colonial powers, but celebrated as liberation movements by their supporters. Politically, governments label opposition groups as terrorists to delegitimize their cause, while the groups may adopt the freedom fighter identity to gain legitimacy. Geopolitical interests further complicate this distinction, as seen during the Cold War, when global powers supported condemned armed groups based on strategic alliances. Cultural narratives also influence these perceptions, with groups often using historical grievances to legitimize their action, while opponents frame them as threats. Terrorism targets civilians to create fear, while freedom fighting is motivated by aspiration for justice, typically involving targeted attacks, methods like guerrilla warfare. The context of violence plays a crucial role in shaping perceptions, with groups labeled as terrorists by some governments being seen as freedom fighters by others. Over time, changing political landscapes, global awareness can shift this perception, as demonstrated by the transformation of Nelson Mandela and the ANC from perceived terrorists to human rights. So learners, let's focus on the key difference between terrorism and freedom fighters. Our first difference is definition and perspective. Terrorism involves the deliberate use of violence, particularly against civilians, to achieve political, ideological, or religious goals. Its primary objective is to instill fear, destabilize societies, and coerce governments or population into specific actions. By targeting non-combatants, terrorism maximizes psychological impact and media attention, blurring the line between combatants and civilians. The motivation behind terrorism typically revolves around enforcing policy changes or undermining public confidence through intimidation. Acts of terrorism, as defined by international frameworks like the UN General Assembly Resolution 149/60, are criminal action designed to provoke widespread fear for political purposes. National laws such as the USA Patriot Act further emphasize the illegitimacy of terrorism due to its indiscriminate violence and harm to innocent lives. Ultimately, terrorism is widely condemned as morally unjustifiable for its reliance on fear and coercion to achieve its aim. In contrast, freedom fighters are individuals or groups engaging in armed struggle to achieve political freedom or independence from oppressive regimes or foreign occupations. They are generally seen as legitimate combatants fighting for self-determination, human rights, and liberation. Unlike terrorists, freedom fighters typically target military and governmental structures, aiming to minimize harm to civilians and adhere to the rules of war. Motivated by justice and overthrow of tyranny, freedom fighters are often celebrated as heroes within their communities. For example, American colonies during the Revolution were viewed as insurgents by the British, but as freedom fighters by their allies and themselves. Similarly, Nelson Mandela and the ANC, initially labeled as terrorists by the apartheid regime, later gained global recognition as freedom fighters in the broader struggle against apartheid and for human rights. Ultimately, while terrorism is condemned for its indiscriminate violence, freedom fighting is often regarded as a justifiable resistance against oppression. However, this perception can evolve with changing historical and political contexts. Dear learners, our second difference is motivation and legitimacy. Terrorists may be driven by a variety of ideological beliefs, including political, religious, or ethnic ideologies. Their actions are primarily aimed at instilling fear, disrupting societies to achieve their goals. This motivation often involves a mix of grievances and aspiration that can be highly radicalized. Terrorist groups often pursue specific political changes, such as the overthrow of a government or the establishment of a new political order. For example, the Marxist-Leninist group Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia sought to overthrow the Colombian government and implement a communist regime. Radical interpretation of religious texts can drive terrorist activities. Groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda exploit religious narratives to justify their violent acts, aiming to establish governance based on their interpretation of religious laws. Ethnic grievances and aspirations for ethnic dominance can also motivate terrorism. For instance, in Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka used terrorism to fight for an independent Tamil state. ISIS is driven by a radical interpretation of Islamic law, seeking to establish a caliphate. Their vision involves strict religious governance and the expansion of their territory through extreme violence. ISIS employs brutal methods, including mass executions, beheadings, terrorist attacks in various countries to spread fear, attract global attention. ISIS justifies its actions through a distorted narrative of religious duty and political grievances against Western influence and regional governments. Founded by Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda aims to expel Western influence from Muslim-majority countries and establish Islamist regimes. Al-Qaeda has carried out numerous high-profile terrorist attacks, including the September 11 attacks on the United States, which killed thousands of civilians. Al-Qaeda uses a combination of political grievances and religious rhetoric to justify its actions, portraying its struggle as a defense of Islam against Western aggression. The violence employed by terrorists is typically seen as unjustified because it lacks legitimate political objectives and indiscriminately targets civilians. This approach undermines any moral or ethical claims to their action, making them universally condemned by the international community. In contrast, freedom fighters are typically motivated by a desire for liberation, justice, and the overthrow of oppressive regimes. The struggle is often rooted in a quest for self-determination and the protection of human rights. Many freedom fighters seek to liberate their nations from foreign occupations or colonial rule. Their aim is to establish sovereignty and national independence. Freedom fighters often fight against systematic injustices, human rights abuses perpetrated by oppressive regimes. The right to self-determination is a fundamental driving force, with freedom fighters seeking to establish governance that reflects the will and aspiration of their people. Led by figures like Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese resistance fought against French colonial rule to achieve national sovereignty. Their struggle involved both political mobilization and armed resistance, gaining legitimacy as part of the broader decolonization movement. The Vietnamese struggle was recognized globally as legitimate, fight for independence, particularly as it aligned with the worldwide wave of decolonization. The Kurdish struggle, particularly in regions of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, aims to establish an autonomous Kurdish state. Kurdish groups employ a combination of armed resistance and political advocacy to protect their cultural and political rights. The Kurdish struggle is seen as a fight for self-determination and protection of ethnic identity, garnering support from various international entities and human rights organizations. Dear learner, our next difference is ethical and moral implication. The legitimacy of freedom fighters' causes is recognized when their goals align with broader principles of freedom and justice, and when their methods respect the rules of war and minimize harm to civilians. This legitimacy is bolstered when their actions are perceived as a part of wider struggle for universal human rights and justice. In summary, motivation are a crucial factor in distinguishing terrorists from freedom fighters. Terrorists are driven by radical ideologies and political agendas, often employing the indiscriminate violence that undermines any moral or ethical claims. Conversely, freedom fighters are motivated by liberation, justice, and self-determination, with their legitimacy recognized when their action align with principles of human rights and minimize civil harm. Dear learners, our next difference is methods and targets. The methods and targets employed by terrorists and freedom fighters are fundamental in distinguishing between the two groups. Methods employed by terrorist tactics are characterized by their focus on creating fear and chaos. These methods are designed to instill terror in the civilian population, disrupt societal stability, and pressure governments into making concessions. Terrorist groups frequently use bombings, including suicide bombings, to cause mass casualties and widespread panic. These attacks are often carried out in crowded public spaces such as markets, transportation hubs, and religious sites to maximize the impact. Targeted killings of political figures, leaders, or influential individuals are used to create instability and eliminate key opponents. These tactics are used to draw attention to their causes, extract concessions from governments, or demand ransoms. Hostage situations are designed to create a high-profile crisis. Armed attacks on civilian gatherings, such as schools, workplaces, or public events, aim to maximize fear and casualties. ISIS has frequently employed suicide bombings to target crowded areas, including marketplaces and mosques, aiming to cause maximum casualties and attract global media attentions. Boko Haram, extremist group in Nigeria, has carried out mass abduction, including the kidnapping of schoolgirls to force government concession and propagate their ideological beliefs. The methods employed by terrorists are widely condemned for their brutality and indiscriminate nature. Primary targets are often civilians, leading to a high toll on the innocent lives. These tactics are considered illegitimate and morally unjustifiable due to the deliberate targeting of non-combatants and the creation of widespread fear and suffering. On the other hand, methods employed by freedom fighters engage in armed struggle but typically target military and governmental structures rather than civilians. Their methods aim to resist oppression while minimizing civilian harm and adhering to the laws of armed conflict. Common freedom fighters, small, mobile units conduct ambushes, raids, and sabotage against larger, more conventional military forces. This tactic is designed to wear down the enemy over time without engaging in large-scale confrontations that could harm civilians. Targeting infrastructure and logistical networks to disrupt the enemy's operations and weaken their control. The Viet Cong utilized guerrilla tactics, focusing on ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attack against US and South Vietnamese forces. Their strategy aimed at wearing down the enemy through prolonged conflict while avoiding significant civilian casualties. Kurdish fighters have employed guerrilla warfare and sabotage against Turkish, Iraqi, and Syrian forces to achieve their goals of autonomy and self-determination. Freedom fighters are more likely to be seen as legitimate combatants when their methods align with international laws of armed conflict, such as the Geneva Conventions. These laws emphasize the protection of non-combatants, the human treatment of prisoners of war, and the principle of proportionality and necessity in the use of force. Freedom fighters who avoid civilian harm, target only military or governmental entities, are seen as adhering to ethical combat principles, using force proportionate to the military advantage gained and ensuring that any collateral damage is minimized, justice by the necessity of the actions. In summary, the methods and targets employed by terrorists and freedom fighters are critical in distinguishing between the two. Terrorists use indiscriminate violence aimed at civilians to create fear and chaos, which is widely condemned and considered illegitimate. Freedom fighters, on the other hand, target military and governmental structures, aiming to minimize civilian harm and adhere to ethical combat principles, thereby gaining legitimacy in their struggle for liberation and justice. Dear learner, our next difference is context and perception. The distinction between a terrorist and a freedom fighter hinges on socio-political and historical context, which shape how individuals and groups are perceived. A terrorist is generally viewed as someone who uses violence or intimidation to achieve political, religious, ideological goals, often targeting civilians. By contrast, a freedom fighter is seen as someone resisting oppression, colonial rule, or injustice, often celebrated by their community as a hero of resistance. These labels are not fixed but depend on who is assigning them and the context in which the actions occur. For example, during the American Revolution, the British labeled the revolutionists as rebels and insurgents, while Americans and sympathetic international audiences saw them as freedom fighters striving for independence and self-governance. The role of context is critical in shaping these perceptions. Domestically, groups fighting for liberations are often seen as freedom fighters by their people, whereas opposing governments may brand them as terrorists. Internationally, perceptions vary, depend on global political alignments and ideological leanings. The Indian independence movement illustrates this complexity. Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent approach garnered global sympathy, legitimizing India's independence struggle. Meanwhile, militant groups like Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army were labeled terrorists by the British but viewed by many Indians as essential to achieving liberation from colonial rule. These differing perceptions highlight how context influences the framing of violent resistance. Perceptions of groups and their actions often evolve over time, reflecting changes in political landscapes and historical narratives. During their struggle, individuals or groups might be condemned as terrorists but later reframed as freedom fighters or heroes. The case of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress exemplifies this shift. Initially, Mandela and the ANC were labeled terrorists for their armed resistance against apartheid. However, as international condemnation of apartheid grew, global advocacy for human rights intensified. Mandela's actions were reinterpreted as part of a legitimate fight for justice. His eventual release, leadership, presidency symbolized a transformation in perception from prisoner to globally recognized statesman. Historical narratives play a pivotal role in shaping and reshaping these distinctions. Victorious movements often craft the dominant narratives, legitimizing their action and casting their opponents in a negative light. Over time, cultural and ideological shifts lead to re-examination of past struggles. For instance, figures like Gandhi, Mandela, and the American revolutionaries are celebrated today as symbols of freedom and justice, while the forces they oppose are often viewed less favorably. These evolving narratives demonstrate the fluidity of labels like terrorist and freedom fighter. In conclusion, the distinction between terrorist and freedom fighter is deeply influenced by context, perspectives, historical narratives. Actions that are condemned by some as terrorism may be celebrated by others as legitimate resistance. The case of the American revolutionaries, the Indian independence struggle, and Nelson Mandela reveal the complexities of violent political struggles and the shifting perception over time. Understanding these distinctions requires a nuanced analysis of socio-political context and the perspectives of all stakeholders involved. Dear learners, next difference is the distinction between a terrorist and a freedom fighter, which is deeply influenced by the perception and legitimacy of their cause within the broader international community. Terrorists are typically viewed as individuals or groups that use violence and fear to achieve political, ideological, or religious goals. Their action often target civilians, public spaces to maximize impact and attention. The international community, including organizations like the United Nations, generally condemns such actions because they violate basic human rights and international laws. Terrorist groups are seldom recognized as legitimate political actors, and their methods are widely criticized as unjustifiable regardless of their motives. For example, groups that carry out indiscriminate bombings or attacks on innocent people are labeled as terrorists because their violence disrupts speech and violates the principles of proportionality and discrimination in conflict. The lack of alignment with internationally recognized standards of justice and morality further delegitimizes their cause. In contrast, freedom fighters, on the other hand, are individuals or groups engaged in struggles for liberation, self-determination, or resistance against oppression or colonial rule. Their cause is often rooted in the pursuit of justice, equality, or independence. If their actions align with international norms, such as targeting only military objectives and avoiding harm to civilians, their cause may be considered legitimate and even garner support from global organizations and countries. For instance, many anti-colonial movements in the 20th century, such as those in India, Algeria, or South Africa, were recognized as legitimate struggles for freedom. The international community often supported these movements through diplomatic or material aid, and their leaders were seen as a symbol of justice rather than perpetrators of violence. It's important to note that the distinction is not always clear-cut, it is highly subjective. One country or group may label an individual or group as a terrorist, while others might see them as a freedom fighters. This duality often depends on political alliances, ideological leanings, and historical context. For example, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress were once labeled as terrorists by the apartheid government in South Africa, but they were widely regarded as freedom fighters by much of the world because their struggle was aimed at dismantling systematic racial oppression. The global perception of a freedom fighter is often linked to their adherence to moral principles, international law, and the proportionality of their actions. In contrast, terrorists are usually seen as employing violence indiscriminately, undermining the legitimacy of any political or ideological goals they claim to pursue. Ultimately, the distinction between the two is shaped by historical, cultural, and political narratives, with significant emphasis on how the international community perceives and responds to their action. So, dear learners, in the conclusion, we can say that the distinction between terrorism, freedom fighting, is a complex and evolving construct shaped by subjective interpretation and shifting socio-political realities. This complexity challenges any attempt at a universal definition, as the motivation, methods, broader context of these groups vary widely. What one group sees as a fight for justice and liberation, another may perceive as an indiscriminate campaign of violence and fear. The dynamic nature of these levels reflects the influence of historical narratives, cultural contexts, and geopolitical interests, making it essential to approach these terms with critical analysis and nuance. The historical transformations of groups like Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, from being labeled terrorists to being celebrated as freedom fighters, underscores the fluidity of these categories. This shift demonstrates that the context in which violent struggles occur and the prevailing global or regional attitudes can profoundly influence how groups are perceived. Such shifts highlight the role of international recognition and the power of dominant narratives in reshaping the image and legitimacy of these groups over time. To truly understand the distinction, it is imperative to examine not only the tactics employed by these groups, but also the principles and objectives underlying their actions. While terrorism often seeks to instill fear, disrupt societal stability, freedom fighting is generally aligned with ideals of self-determination, justice, or resistance to oppression. Yet the overlap in tactics and the divergence in interpretation remind us that these distinctions are not always clear-cut. Depending on the observer perspective, the same action may be viewed as either a moral imperative or an unjustifiable atrocity. The more ambiguity necessitates a broader and more inclusive framework for analysis, one that goes beyond the binary categorization of groups as either terrorists or freedom fighters. So by doing so, we can better appreciate the historical, cultural, political factors that shape the struggles and the narratives surrounding them. A nuanced understanding of these terms also fosters a more informed, empathetic dialogue about the causes, consequences of violent conflicts, enabling us to address their root causes, works toward more equitable, sustainable resolutions. Ultimately, the discourse surrounding terrorism and freedom fighting should move beyond simplistic levels to embrace the complexities of human struggle and the diverse paths toward justice and liberation. Only through such a balanced and informed approach can we begin to untangle the moral, political dilemmas these terms embody and recognize their profound effect on the trajectory of global history and politics. Now, learners, let's focus on the possible questions that emerge from the above discussion. Number 1, what are the key differences between terrorism and freedom fighting? Number 2, how do historical and political contexts shape the distinction between terrorism and freedom fighting? Number 3, can a group or individual be simultaneously viewed as a terrorist and a freedom fighter? What ethical and moral considerations come into play when distinguishing between terrorism and freedom fighting? Number 5, how does the distinction between terrorism and freedom fighting affect international diplomacy and relations? So, learner, in this final video, we have explored the key difference between terrorism and freedom fighting, along with their significance. I hope the explanation provided in all 3 videos of this unit have helped you understand the profound meaning of terrorism, its relevance in the present context. Thank you for your engagement and dedication throughout this series.